My name is Charlie White. I'm Executive Director of the Social Science Education Consortium. SSEC was founded at Purdue University in 1963 and incorporated in Indiana 2 years later. Irving Morissette served as its first executive director. The organization then gathered a group of social scientists and social science educators to advance the study of the disciplines and serve as a vanguard for the new social studies movement. In the nearly 60 years since its founding, SSEC has advanced the mission of research, curriculum development projects, professional development in the field. It's also sought to adapt its work to changes in the field and the educational needs of the nation's students. Changes in SSEC and in the field are the focus of this first of this academic year's webinars, entitled Facing the Challenges of Social Studies in Past and Present. To tell you more about today's webinar and to get the ball rolling, I'll turn the session back to SSEC President Sarah Demoni of Auburn University. Sarah?
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. We are recording this session so that we can share it with others who are not available to be here tonight, and then others who may be interested and can kind of learn from this panel and our discussion as we move forward. The kind of way we've organized this tonight is that we're going to start with one question that each of the panelists is going to answer, and then we have a few more designated questions that we're going to ask the panelists, and they can kind of answer as they like and have want to speak to certain questions. And after that time of kind of organized questions, we'll open it up to everyone to have more of just a discussion about kind of the field of social studies and how we hope as scholars to work within it and continue to work to better the field and our society that we're in. So thank you again, and we will just jump in and get started. So we work together. There are a few of us in SSEC that works on an outreach committee right now that is mainly focused on hosting webinars and providing spaces for SSEC members to keep thinking together. And so on the committee is Dean Vesperman, Matt Messias, and Adinian Perry, and Brandon Haas, who is not able to be here this evening. And so we'll jump in and answer or ask some of the questions as we get started. So the first question that we have for panelists this evening is, how has the field of social studies evolved throughout your career? And so I'll call on each panelist, and if you can introduce yourself and then answer that question in about 3 minutes, and we'll go on to the next one. So Dr. Hahn, would you mind starting with the question?
Since I have the ancient history, I'm Carol Hahn, and I'm a professor emerita at Emory University in Atlanta, which will get the rain on the weekend. So when I came in to social studies was in the 1960s and 70s. And at the height of what was then called the New Social Studies projects and the New Social Studies. And so I came in at a time when the field was looking kind of grand at inquiry, at the social sciences, as well as issue-centered. In those days, there was such a thing as National Science Foundation funding for the consortium, as well as for individual scholars. And in those days, we were focused on a model of research, development, and dissemination of ideas, of methods, of curriculum projects, and so forth in social studies. And then I would say, just briefly, because others will probably elaborate more, but my take on it would be that in the 1980s, multicultural perspectives and global perspectives became more prominent and with more attention to women's experiences. In the 90s, I feel as if social studies became very reactive, and the accountability movement put us in positions that we were always defending and dealing with testing and standards and so forth. And I think I'm going to leave others to say more about the contemporary. I have it written down, but I'm worried about how we're ever going to get through everybody. So I'll only take us to the 90s.
Thank you. Dr. Thornton, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I entered the field, the first NCSS I ever attended was in 1983 in San Francisco when Carol was president. And I remember her as an august and imposing figure in that position, as I've told Carol before. The question, we'd probably chide most graduate students for asking such a broad question, Dean, but I divided it into two parts. One to do with theory and research, about which I'll make 3 points, and one to do with practice, because I think that the two throughout the history of social studies have been fairly different things a lot of the time, at least more than we'd wish. Under theory and research, I'd say from the 1980s that I'm talking about to now, for me, among the most striking changes were the turns in research methods and questions, from a quantitative dominated research agenda to a somewhat structuralist, to a post-structuralist, and of course the big identity turns in race, gender, and so forth that have become so dominant in the field. The second thing that I think happened in the 80s and the 90s was another turn, a cognitive turn, and I think it became associated with an increased interest in social studies, which in some ways is a revival of the new social studies, in some ways a departure, with disciplinary thinking, and especially, how do historians think, therefore how should we teach students, how do geographers think, etc. The third thing was somewhat contradictory to the second, is that I think there's been a greater attention, at least by some people like Linda Levstick and Sarah Bednarz in geography, in the NCSS standards, in the work of Keith Barton, and I would hope myself, in the fact that whether you like it or not, social studies is inherently interdisciplinary. There's no such thing as, history without geography or geography without history and so forth. So 3 things about the theory and research level. 3, actually I've got 5 under practice. I think in the time I've been in the field, there's been a continuing decline in elementary social studies to the point that it's almost expunged from programs below about 4th grade these days. Second, there's been, I think, a noticeable decline in the role of geography in social studies. Something that is, to me, is so important, but doesn't even evoke much comment except for geographic educators like Sarah Bednarz. So it's sort of been an unnoticed demise almost. In many states, like Georgia, where Carol is, like Florida, where I was, I'm an emeritus professor, and the daylight you see behind me is because it's afternoon here in Los Angeles, where I live. The decline in geography has been pretty steep and largely unremarked in states, as I was saying, like Georgia and Florida and Indiana, I believe, and so forth, have even got rid of geography altogether at the secondary level. I know in the case of Georgia, it was ostensibly, as in many other states, because it was going to be integrated into other courses, but I'm not convinced that leads to much treatment. A third thing that has happened with NCSS and SSEC is there's been, as I mentioned before, in theory and research, a renewed interest in the disciplines themselves. And certainly, if you look from a practice point of view, the C4 the framework is almost totally as if social studies simply consisted of 4 separate subjects, or at least that's the way I read it. In fact, pretty much the opposite of the national standards in social studies that the NCSS had sponsored just a few years before. The fourth thing in practice is that everything changes, nothing changes, I think. I'm still enamored of a comment that John Goodlad from UCLA made in the 1980s when he did a national study of schooling and school subjects. And he said that to paraphrase Goodlad, that the subjects taught in the social sciences seem as if they would be of great human interest, but something strange seems to have happened to them on the way to the classroom. And I think that was as true in the 1980s as it is now of most of what is going on. And the fifth and last point, before you sort of decide that I'm attacking everything that's going on in educational practice by the Goodland comment, I want to say that I think most instruction that I've seen over the 40 years or so I've been looking in American classrooms is not bad instruction. The problem is that it's not inspiring either. And the major problem is its lack of purpose a lot of the time. That the things we say we really treasure, like critical thinking and so forth, tend to get lost in transmission of information. And like Goodlad's comment, I don't think that's really changed terribly much in most places most of the time, in the time since I first was involved with SSC and NCSS. Okay, that'll do me. I hope that was more than 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lepstick, would you like to chime in?
It helps to be unmuted, doesn't it? I'm Linda Lepstick, Professor Emerita from the University of Kentucky. Like Steve, I came into NCSS in 1983 at San Francisco, and we both got to meet Carol. And the three of us have been friends for a good long time as a result. A lot of what they've already said are similar to the things that I jotted down. So I'm going to be a little bit more personal and a little less general, maybe. In the two areas that I'm most interested in, research in history education has exploded over the course of my career. When I came in, we used to have these little dinners at NCSS where we'd get together anybody who was interested in history, research on historical thinking and kids, and we started out with 3 of us. And the last time that we tried to get together for dinner was in New Orleans, and there were 35 people, and we couldn't find a restaurant that would hold us. So it became sort of the cottage industry for NCSS in many ways, that along with civic education. The other thing that I've been most interested in is a shift from telling people what they should teach because we think that sounds kind of nice to do it that way, to actually saying, how do we know how kids learn? And so from my point of view, one of the biggest changes over the course of my career has been a shift in social studies to paying attention to how children and adolescents make sense out of the disciplines, make sense out of the integration of those disciplines. And in some ways, we lagged behind other fields. Part of my doctoral work was in literacy studies, and literacy has been doing that forever. And so I based a lot of my own early research on work that they were doing rather than what was coming out of social studies. Don't have to do that anymore. We've got our own. So that part is really good. The second piece has to do with the kind of research. I think probably when Steve and I came in, the primary paradigm was quantitative research. And that has shifted, but we're still not balanced about it. I mean, we went, oh, look, you could do qualitative. We went, let's only do qualitative. And it's only been fairly recently that a few people have moved back into more quantitative things. I think Carol's work has done a remarkably good job of using quantitative data and getting it out there for all of us to see. I think that Paul Fitchett, I'm going to screw up names totally. I'm sorry. The quantitative work that he does and some others are really good, but I would like to see a balance. I'd like to see more mixed methods in terms of the kind of research that we have. The other thing is a little bit more broad-based. over the course of my career, there have been our ongoing attempts to work well with others. And we don't always do that with remarkable success. These are usually around political issues, around standards issues. For me, it was working all the way through. I started working with NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, on the history standards, and then also on the history assessments. And then, we went through just a horror show with some of the early history standards. And we're coming out of that now with, like, we may not get history at all. We're just going to get some kind of political commentary that I find incredibly depressing. So the history wars were in their infancy. Now they won. Not thrilled about that. And finally, there is more attention to diversity and in more multiple forms than when we came in. The field is less a straight white boys club. And it certainly was when I entered. And I think that has been good. And I think there was, Steve, you'll probably remember what year the first journal, the first TRSE issue that dealt with issues of sexuality was one that Steve has a really important piece in. A number of other of us had articles in that journal, and then it just sort of sat there for a while. But in more recent years, there's more people who have been doing that work, and it's exciting to see that.
Yeah, it was 2002. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a little late for us to have come to that. But it was a little late for us to come to women. Other history had been doing women for a long time. Oh, that's a terrible way of saying it. Had been investigating women's lives and histories for a long time, has that. Way before social studies did. And that was, when I first came, an incredibly frustrating thing. I had worked with women's studies in my graduate work too, and was frustrated not to find it a big deal at NCSS. I think I'm done.
Thank you. Dr. Evans, Emily?
Being that I haven't been in the field for as long as my counterparts, I might have a little bit of a differing perspective. My name is, I like to go by Dr. K because my last name can be quite lengthy sometimes. But my title is, I'm the founder of the Mindful Prof. I recently left full-time academia, but I'm still an instructor at the University of Central Florida. So what I've realized in my brief time in the field, over the past, I entered in the field in 2010. So a lot of what I tend to study is predominantly because it was very new in the early 2000s and early 2010s. So I study a lot of affect in the classroom, specifically examining social emotional learning, looking at how mindfulness shows up. And I'll leave the mindfulness part on the side because that is a very specific niche. But looking at how social emotional learning has really evolved and integrated quite well within social studies because of a lot of policy initiatives. What has been interesting, like Linda was saying, is that a lot of our counterparts in other content areas have long been doing this work. So I think of literacy when I think of affect in the classroom, and how a lot of what I had to examine and integrate into my own personal research and in practice was because of literacy. What I often think about now, especially since social emotional learning has become politicized in some states, I'm currently in Florida, where I look at the policy initiatives that have recently taken place within the past couple of years, and that social emotional learning is outlawed in some aspects. So it's been interesting to see how social emotional learning has taken off in some states, especially within social studies content. But now, because of the politicization of such things within a policy stance, it's been it's slowly being removed from certain state standards. So it's quite fascinating to see within the last couple of years how not just social emotional learning has shifted within social studies because of politicization, but also other the woke agenda has shifted as well. So I'll leave it at that because I haven't heard it social emotional learning mentioned, and that is my specific area of focus. But that will be my contribution for that question.
Thank you, Kelsey. Dr. Ferrer-Stone.
Hello, my name is Jessica Ferreira-Stone. I'm an associate professor at Western Washington University, and I'm debating whether to go off of my notes or to jump off of what Kelsey just told us. I probably should go off of my notes instead of trusting myself to speak off the cuff. But I really appreciated what you had to say there, Kelsey, about the changing field, particularly as we look at some of of what is currently happening in Florida. And then you look at where I'm at in Washington, which, trust me, we have our challenges as well, but we also have a mandated Indigenous curriculum. And so when you place those in juxtaposition to one another, and we really look at the field as a whole, it really begs the question of where are we going? Because I feel like we're running in opposite directions. Okay, I trusted myself that much to go off script. Let me go back on script for a moment here. I took this question in a different direction than some of my colleagues, and I really wanted to look through the lens of a practitioner and how has the field changed for those who are not in the ivory tower, but rather sitting with children every day, and how has that evolved for them? And the word that I kept coming back to was technology. And this is a double-edged sword, right? Because the work that we're able to produce as researchers can get to practitioners much faster, for example. And so this is one of the positive things that can happen with technology. Another positive thing that has come about the field with technology is we know that our research has told us that our textbooks are incredibly skewed, right? And so practitioners are able to supplement the curriculum to amplify historically marginalized voices in ways that they didn't often have access to in the past. I mentioned it was a double-edged sword because, as we know, finding information isn't the challenge. Finding the time to sift through how much information is out there and finding not just ways to amplify historically marginalized voices, but to find high quality resources that amplify historically marginalized voices has become a real challenging task. And then lastly, on this double-edged sword of technology, as I look to our most recent history, I think about the pandemic and how classrooms, how living rooms turned into classrooms, and the roles that each person in the room, how they evaluated what social studies should be and how it could be and what it needed to be, has really put social studies in the limelight, in the spotlight, in a way that I don't think we had, which is interesting because we're not tested in the same way that math and literacy, and yet we're still in a spotlight where so many people are watching what our educators are saying and doing. And so to sum it up, just to say that technology has really evolved the field. It's given us access to a lot of information, but it's really provided us with the charge of sifting through, finding high quality resources to amplify historically marginalized voices.
Thank you. And Dr. Vesterman, can you round out this question right now?
Yes. Dean Vesterman, University of Wisconsin, River Falls. Let's see, it came into the field again, 2010, and then joined SSEC just 5 years ago, right before the pandemic. So when I was asked the question, what are the problems, I immediately started to think about, what is it like in the upper Midwest, and what are the problems that we're facing here, and especially in the field of, teacher preparation and teacher education. And so what I saw was really, what stood out to me were three salient issues. And the first is, I'm quite concerned about the growing move to censor teachers and faculty, either through the use of these so-called anti-CRT bills or academic balance bills that we've seen that really have, erupted in the last year and a half. And I think one of the problems is that we're really needing to center on the idea that, this is really an attempt to censor the academic freedom of teachers first. And then as they're becoming in states like Florida, where they were very successful in silencing teachers, how they have changed it now to silencing, faculty. it's concerning because of the fact that, and that as our classrooms are becoming more significantly diverse, I mean, what the general fact is simple. Less than half of all students currently attending schools today in the United States are white. So we have this major demographic shift going on, and at a time in which we need teachers who are going to be more aware of the diversity of the students and the diversity of culture, right? That we're in turn really going about making sure that our future teachers don't have the tools they need to be able to function in that classroom. And thus, of course, we can, an underlying trend in all of this, of course, is that attack on multicultural education, which we know, came about, through the work that SSEC did, through James Banks' work and others, other scholars, in the 1970s, 1980s. The next is in Wisconsin, we're facing really an interesting attack on teacher education through particular groups like the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, which has published, several papers. They've gotten editorials in major newspapers attacking our teacher education system. And part of that, of course, is the goal to deprofessionalize education, right? To, in the sense that under the system by which we have this teacher shortage, right? We deprofessionalize education in the hopes of saying, well, if we deprofessionalize, we'll produce enough teachers to fill the classroom, even though all the data we know is from the states that have gone furthest in deprofessionalization. They have far worse teacher shortages than the states that have not gone that far. But again, that concern is because when the public's mindset is that deprofessionalization is a solution, it's hard to get them to elect politicians who won't follow that path. And then the last one, and this really goes along with what Linda was talking about. Despite the huge gains that we've had in neuroscience and the really understanding how children construct knowledge and the role that movement and emotion, right, that engagement, right, Gardner's work of, looking at multiple, the 9 frames of mind, despite all of these great advances, it seems to me that we have a serious push to go backwards in how we teach social studies and backwards towards forced memorization and recitation of facts. I mean, we see that just in Wisconsin with the passage of the civics graduation test that students have to pass, and the reality is that, of course, students are, they're passing this test. So it's not a barrier to graduation for the vast majority of students, but it's really keeping students who are low SES, students of color, and students with learning needs from being able to, to pass this test. And 2, I worry that this push back to memorization is going to really start having the effect that we know from research is when students focus so much on memorizing facts, they're less likely to be civically engaged once they turn 18. And so I'm concerned about this only exacerbating the civic empowerment gap. And so those are the issues that I think are right now in the field.
Thank you all for sharing some of your initial thoughts on how you have seen changes in the field. I think we're going to head over to Anne to ask the next question. And Dr. Nelson, I think we have a few questions that are prepared ahead of time, and then we'll come in and open it up to everybody. But if you all have questions that you're thinking about and want to put into the chat so we don't lose them or lose sight of them, then please go ahead and do so.
Awesome. So this is the first question for the entire panel, and I'm going to put it out there and then everybody can jump in, and then we're going to move to Matt for the second question. So what would you see as the top 3 issues that the field of social studies will be wrestling with in the upcoming decade?
I'll go first. I think Dean kind of took us there with bringing it to present day. And so Dean, feel free to chime in here as well. But I think the attack of critical race theory and its connection to social studies is very much going to be something that we are going to need to wrestle with, hopefully for less than a decade, but likely for more than a decade. And I want to quote Gloria Ladson-Billings as saying, my particular interest is in critical race theory in education, not to teach teachers about it. I don't expect teachers to do this work. I don't expect teachers to do anything around critical race theory in grades kindergarten through grade 12. In fact, I don't actually introduce the notion of critical race theory to undergraduates. They have no use for it. The theory is important at the graduate level. It is important for analyzing and making sense of a social phenomenon. Right. And so when we look at Gloria Ladson-Billings, a founder of critical race theory, and hearing her words say this, it has no place in elementary school. We are teaching equity, we are teaching justice, we are teaching acceptance in our elementary schools. But to call it that and to ban that would not gain the same amount of attention as to ban critical race theory. And so I think a large portion of our work is to make sure that people understand what critical race theory is and that it has its place in understanding a phenomenon, but it is not the same as doing equity work, social justice work, acceptance, understanding one another, which is critical to the work of social studies, beginning in early grades. Because this is the other problem I have. We don't teach elementary social studies. And if we do, we have to coddle these children. And I say that as my 6-year-old is on the other side of this wall, hopefully not destroying my house. Grandma's here. Okay. So I say that knowing, having a 6-year-old at home, that we say, oh, we have to preserve their innocence. But then when they become high schoolers, we're surprised that they have a habit of thinking in a particular way. And we say, oh, it's so hard to break that habit. And you just can't have it both ways. You can't say it's too hard to break the habit, but not be willing to start at an early age in age-appropriate ways to teach equity and justice, which I think are part of social studies.
So you just want us to jump in, yes? Oh,
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, sorry.
All
I was muted.
Okay. Okay. So I agree with what you're saying. I think there's a larger piece of this, and that is that we're looking at the survival of education for any kind of pluralist democracy. And it seems to me that that should be the umbrella for whatever else we're going to say that this organization or any other social studies organization ought to be doing. That it's not a matter of going in and convincing people that CRT isn't what they think it is. I belong to a bunch of organizations of well-educated, socially active people. And as soon as they find out that I'm in social studies, one of the things they ask me about is critical race theory. And they have all the same misconceptions that people on the right seem to have. And they're worried that, you know, people are brainwashing small children. And I thought, oh, we don't even have time for that in elementary school. There's no time for brainwash anybody. But that kind of attention from us means that we have to learn how to talk to people who are like us, talk to people who are not like us, and to be able to explain what it actually looks like to do this work in classrooms. Use less jargon if we can manage that. We're probably not very good at that. Be able to show them what kids do, what kids can do. Most of the folks that I talk to are totally surprised at the intellectual ability of elementary school children, which blows my mind because they all have kids. So you would think they would know better, but they don't. That these kids can handle content, they can handle controversies. At one point in my career, I taught in a Jewish parochial school. And the parents came to me and asked me if I would teach the unit on the Holocaust, even though that wasn't particularly part of the curriculum I was teaching that year, because they were desperate for their children to hear this, but they weren't comfortable saying it, for all kinds of reasons, including that some of them were survivors. when parents understand what you're doing in the classroom, sometimes they're more willing to allow you to do more interesting kind of things. But ultimately, we have a moral obligation to be educating kids from preschool through 12th grade, through the universities, to be better at this democracy thing. I'll leave it there and let other people jump in.
I would just say, and Dean, I think it was, mentioned Jim Banks, and that goes to the comments you just made. Recently I was in touch with Jim Banks, kind of the father of multiculturalism and social studies, I guess you could say. And he just has a new book of his essays out. And my former colleague, when I was at Teachers College, Margaret Crocco, wrote a sort of introduction or something like that, which Jim sent me. And in there, toward the end, she warns, you know, after much lauding of Jim's work, rightly so, she warns of the restrictions, as Nell Noddings did and so forth, that we can't really convince anybody of anything in terms of equity and so forth, or democracy or anything else, unless they're trusting what a purposeful teacher has to say, that it's feeling that motivates human action, not just giving them more information or speaking to them. And I think we've, you know, that puts a high bar then for teacher education. You know, I know Linda has done some thoughtful work over the years on, you know, what is a good methods course and so forth. But I don't think it comes because we inculcate. I think it comes because we appeal to people's feelings, which leads them to rethink things. I mean, if we certainly live politically in a time where it's blatantly obvious that just giving people information, even if it's correct, doesn't change their mind, just as if it's incorrect doesn't change their mind. It's the frame they're coming to it from. So I think, you know, we need to think of purposeful teachers. I think we need to think of classrooms. I mean, Carol did some work back in the late 80s, early 90s with some of her colleagues at Emory, or maybe they were students, Carol, on classroom climate and so forth, which got at some of these sort of issues. But that kind of line of work, as far as I know, died out. But I don't think anything else is going to make much difference. I recognize, though, given what we've just heard about the horrors of what's happening in Florida and other places, that this is completely at odds with what's happening to teacher education. I see that. And I mean, I think that's perhaps part of the agenda of why teacher education is being undermined.
Sarah, can I take a shot at this? But putting the two together, when we were given the question about the next 10 years, I thought of it in terms of how do we promote or nurture both deliberative democracy and social justice in a polarized world, and recognizing that our teachers and our students and so forth live in blue communities, they live in red communities, they live in purple communities. And we're in positions that, you know, we're challenged to help them regardless of which is the context. But if our goal is a democratic society, I think this is, you know, kind of the primary emphasis over the next 10 years. I have two others that we were given three, but those two are just going to be out there for the next decade for sure.
Can I add that I think that all these issues are integrated, but I think often like what would happen with the field of teaching if we didn't have teachers? So maintaining quality teachers, I think, is going to be a very big issue, and redefine, like, there's been a lot of redefinition of what quality means, more because the so many teachers now leaving the field, inclusive of what's happening within social studies education and within academia. I think a lot needs to change in order to maintain retention And the cyclical nature of this, thinking about retention, not only within the colleges of education and maintaining the numbers there to actually have a college of education, since some of them have been shut down within the last decade, and also thinking about how to retain K through 12 teachers in the field. So I think it's interconnected with all these issues that are at play. Again, contextually being in Florida, there's a lot happening with retention, like trying to figure out how to solve this issue. And again, it's all interconnected, but without teachers, like how will the field continue? So I don't know where to actually chip away at the issue, whether we start within higher ed in preparing teachers, whether it starts in policy, or whether it starts in actually continuing to create a positive environment within the K through 12 classroom. Again, I don't have a specific answer. I'm trying to discover what that looks like, but it's all integrated.
So this has been fantastic. And in the effort of making sure that we move along to more the past and present aspects, I'm going to hand it over to Matt for the second question.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, so I'm going to ask you to put on your temporal brains here, because this is a kind of a past and present question asked all at once. So feel free to interpret this how you'd like. But the question is, what issues in social science education do or did you see SSEC uniquely addressing? So whether you were earlier in the evolution of SSEC, or today, or both, what sort of unique social science education issues does SSEC uniquely address?
I think that Carol had her hand up first.
Just because as I was thinking of this, I realized how much it has shifted from the early years of SSEC. And I thought that some things that were done, maybe it's time to rethink in a slightly different context. So, you know, in the early years, SSEC was made up of people in the various social science departments as well as education. And they set that model so that, you know, I was in the education department, but when I did teacher workshops, I worked with a colleague from political science, a colleague from anthropology, a colleague from, you know, economics, the summer institutes. And I don't see that sort of thing happening in NCSS or in KUFA or in SSEC recently. Now, I recognize that one of the things also that happened in the disciplines as well with postmodernism, as maybe within the disciplines, there is not as unity about perspectives. But still, I don't think we've been reaching out to try to understand new scholarship in social science fields the way we once did. And I wonder if that might not be a possibility. Another is, in the early years, the organization worked as much with curriculum coordinators, whether they are state level, you know, personnel, as well as professors. And this was particularly on the dissemination side of things, that we are all in the business about trying to make or help social studies educators become aware of new knowledge. Anyway, I don't see us involving the coordinators or the state people the way we used to. And then another is that we have, SSEC has had off and on success in working with our international colleagues, right from, you know, there was a conference in Guildford, England in 1980. There's another one. And lately we've been doing quite a bit internationally, but it hasn't always involved our international colleagues, which I understand those of you who were in Ireland really benefited from that this time. And I think that's a kind of thing. Again, CUFA doesn't do it, NCSS doesn't do it, maybe SSEC is the size to do it. And yeah, and SSEC has done it off and on.
One of the things that I really appreciate about SSEC is the amount of personalization that occurs within the organization, and the mentorship that seems to always be evolving, that I have not experienced within NCSS nor CUFA. It seems more supportive to young scholars, where there's always a desire to reach out and understand what the most recent literature is, how they can support their early career, which I have greatly benefited from. So I really do appreciate that. Maybe this is definitely a more personalized thing, but it's definitely from what my lived experience and my appreciation for SSEC as a whole.
I agree with a lot of what's already been said, particularly the notion of if we're going to think of social studies as interdisciplinary, then it makes sense for us to really be that. And when I joined SSEC early on, I don't know, 80s, 90s, someplace like that, there was a bit more of that kind of thing, and it has reduced over time. And pretty much the last few times I went, it was almost entirely NCSS, CUFA people, and not that many young scholars. So I think it's really nice that emphasis on young scholars and providing that mentorship is there. I would like to see a return to really thinking interdisciplinarily, to think about the content that we're teaching. We had that period of time in the 80s and somewhat into the 90s when it was, well, as long as you teach them how to think, it doesn't matter what they're thinking about. And that notion drives me crazy, because it does matter. If we're going to educate for democracy, it matters what content kids are learning. It matters what kinds of questions they're asking, all of that. And SSEC seems to me to be a really good place to start those kinds of conversations. The second piece is to go back to the international part that Carol was talking about. There are organizations that do a better job than any of us in the United States have done with the international parts. One of the history organizations that I work with in Europe has people from all over the world. And, I'm from every, well, not Antarctica and all that, but, from every country that's doing anything with history and archaeology. And those conversations are amazing. And right now I'm working with 4 colleagues, and we're publishing a piece that looks at the challenges to teaching history in each of our cultures. And, what kind of things have we done to try to rectify some of the problems that we face? It seems to me that SSEC could do that kind of thing the way that it seems that you did while you were in Ireland. And if more of that could happen, I would think that would be a much more appealing way. We used to joke in SSEC towards the end when things were reducing in terms of people, that we could just turn into like a tourist group, and we would just visit interesting places. But that's not quite, I think, what the intent of this organization is. And I would like to see serious international cross-cultural work. If nothing else, it makes you realize that all that work you did in the United States, saying, for me personally, saying here's how kids think, is really how kids in the United States think. It's not necessarily how kids in Ireland think or how kids in wherever. And it would be good for us to recognize that we are not the sort of the bar for deciding how people think. I'm done, Charlie.
If that's right. If I can hop in for a second, I know that a bunch of you were at the Costa Rica conference.
Yeah.
And out of that came a book on sustainability. And each of the chapters looked at sustainability from a different social science, which struck me as consistent with sort of the idea of what SSEC was doing. And, I've been tossing around in my head something like, well, to do something like that in climate change, for example. Well, what is the social science in climate change? Or even what is the geography in climate change, where you're conveying knowledge about the discipline of geography, but also applying it to an issue. But I love the idea of trying to reach out more to the social scientists. The problem is that a lot of social scientists just aren't there the way they used to be in terms of their interest in schools. They're there, it's just hard to find them often. Joe Stoltman has been a great source of information about that because he actually volunteered for, including Michael Sullivan, by the way, said, you really got to get in touch with these guys and bring them into the fold too, because he's a geographer and there are other geographers in the organization. So I just thought I'd remind people of the sustainability book that we did in Costa Rica, and it was international because we also had participation from our hosts in Costa Rica. And I'll bet we'll do that again, that you'll see from the book that comes out of the Dublin conference.
Well, and it's a chance to educate ourselves and broaden our own knowledge and understanding. One of the things I really worry about is that we're in a very isolationist period. We as a society now is very isolationist, and we are focused so much on issues in the US that it's going to take really extra effort in our organizations and with one another to see that we keep having experiences to appreciate that we're one culture among many, we're one nation among many, that we aren't the only one. And this is, what you're talking about now are ways to do that.
So what I'm thinking when I'm hearing this conversation is, and I'm looking at my experiences in the university so far, I wonder if the compartmentalization of universities is partially part of the problem. There's not a lot of, I'd like a good example on universities I've been at, have not promoted trying to do cross-disciplinary research or promoting, history faculty working with teacher education faculty or teacher education faculty working with geography faculty. There's nothing in there that's, in tenure promotion requirements that promotes looking for or promoting that sort of interdisciplinary thinking or approach to how we do research. And two, the other thing I've seen more so in the sciences than in the social sciences, there is a devaluation of teaching and education, right? And so, one of the problems I've faced at both of the universities I've worked at is it's hard to recruit young people to be science teachers. Part of the reason why is because science faculty don't value science teaching. And I've seen that in some history professors, they don't value, right, the idea that students would go and become, middle school or high school history teachers. And so I wonder if that's the case. And then the other idea is thinking about, and the thought was, going forward as SSEC, maybe what we need to do is provide a voice, a space for interdisciplinary approaches in like some sort of publication beyond books, right? Or beyond books tied to a particular conference. Can we provide a space where there is, a journal or, either whether it's published or physically or online that allows, other social scientists to come and, economists, political scientists, geographers, et cetera, to publish their work in ways in which they know that their community that's going to see this work is more interdisciplinary. But those are just my thoughts.
Dean, to bounce off of your idea there, I also wonder if there's a space where, as we produce this type of work that you're talking about, that we ensure that it's not locked behind paid firewalls. Because not everyone has access to this information, right? And so we consider what is the cost of purchasing the book? What is the cost of accessing that journal? How many webinars can we host that are free that we make available to others? Do we want to go a podcast route? But just being really mindful of how often academia is locked behind paid firewalls.
Yeah.
I think something that brings together a lot of what has been said, and not necessarily everything, but the role of social scientists and social studies professors and that working together in SSEC is sort of strikes me as what has, and this relates to what Jessica was just saying, is what has been to me always the special thing about SSEC. I remember, for example, some years ago they did a booklet on the American West. Well, NCSS isn't going to do that in the same way because, one, it requires social scientists, not just social studies educators, and there aren't many of them in NCSS anymore. And second, NCSS tends to be confined these days more than it used to be, it seems to me, to the idea that, it has to have something directly to do with practice. You're not going to find any high school teaching, probably a unit on the American West, but it could inform a lot of stuff in literature as well as geography courses and history courses and so forth. And to me, those have been the things I found most valuable, and like what Charlie's saying, perhaps this sustainability volume that I haven't seen would do the same sort of thing. All those wonderful things we did based on issues back in the 80s that Laurel Singleton did on the New Deal and on the coming of the Civil War and so forth. Once again, it goes beyond, I think, most of what NCSS does. And but that depends upon relationships that really do get informed by subject matter specialists and not just social studies educators. I mean, you see with a lot of the NCSS journals now that basically they don't want to publish anything that doesn't tell you about, social studies and the young learner. If, it isn't based upon something that was actually taught in an elementary school classroom, they don't want to publish it, period. Now, what does that do to imaginative alternatives of things that aren't happening, like the American West as a holistic study and so forth? Anyway.
Hey, Stephen. By the way, Stephen, the public issues series, we have many of those titles. They're now digitized in SSEC, and I'm in the process of doing more. We have gotten inquiries from the field about whether they're still available and how to acquire them. So there is a niche of interest in the Newman and Oliver work that we might think, well, what do we want to do with that? Laurel was the one who sort of spearheaded the revision of some of the old titles. But we have titles going back into the late 60s that were the original versions. I think we probably have about 20 in total. I'd love to find something to do with those, either to revise them or package them into a publication that would make them visible to the field again. Because, we hate to lose something as innovative as that. Yeah. Thank you for your comment about that.
Well, that brings up that, for so many years, SSEC functioned on getting grants that enabled them to undertake projects.
Yeah.
And nobody does that anymore. So, but the question is, whether it's worth, we can't resolve it tonight in one time period, but some brainstorming about, are there places where there are monies available to do particular things that SSEC can do well? I mean, maybe curriculum development is possible in some areas, but it might not be anymore. That now Charlie's suggesting, reusing existing materials, but it is worth kind of thinking, can an organization do that? One other thought about the social scientists, the people in political science or economics or geography. it never worked well to try to focus on getting the numbers up as members of SSEC because of the thing about, over time, how central is it to what they do? But it has always worked well to deliberately invite some of the speakers to an annual meeting who are going to bring us insights from their field, or to write chapters for books that, have other ways. So I think to think creatively about different ways of engaging social science perspectives that SSEC can do and that NCSS really can't.
Mhm.
So I want to jump in and kind of summarize some of that and then open it up for others to share, to ask questions or to chime in with some thoughts of those that have been listening to the panelists. But we kind of, Anne asked this question about issues that we foresee right now and at least within the next decade within the field. And many of you have started to kind of answer what we can do about that. Dr. Hahn, I think that you mentioned the need for us to focus on preserving like a deliberative democracy and also seeking social justice and how we can do those together, that they need to happen simultaneously or synergistically. And so thinking about that as kind of a hope and a goal of what's needed, I'd love to hear what others are thinking in terms of how SSEC can really work towards those two goals that we see as needed in the social studies, but just more broadly in society. And I'll kind of open that up. And I know that Dr. Nelson, you've had your hand up, and I want to make sure that you can chime in first if you'd like to. And then after that, anybody can kind of share out and have more open discussion about that. Oh no, did he go?
I think he's gone.
Oh no.
Oh,
Well,
I'd like
hopefully
to
he'll come back.
piggyback off of, okay.
Go ahead, Kelsey.
I'd like to piggyback off of what Carol was mentioning, because I'm a public scholar now, and I think that a lot of what is shifting in the field, there needs to be the incorporation of more public scholar work, such as grassroots organizations, working with nonprofits, and inviting them to the table, as oftentimes there's very similar voices that are coming to these conferences that are coming from an academic perspective, but it would be really nice to hear not just practitioners from a K through 12 classroom, but thinking about how we could reimagine the organization in working alongside different ways that education is now showing up in. So I think about different nonprofits that I consult for on how they're partnering with different school districts and how integral they are in the process of keeping education alive. But they're not doing a whole lot of research. I mean, they are promoting some research internally, but they're not doing a lot of peer-reviewed research. I think that their voices are really valuable, and it would be really interesting to hear the interdisciplinary ideas from them specifically. So thinking more broadly, not just within academic spaces, I think that's really valuable, but bringing other voices to the table is really critical as well.
There used to be funding for NCSS members to study a particular issue. So for instance, Matt Downey and I a long time ago got some money to look at the status of history in our field. Other people have done other sorts of things with it. Why not think about SSEC thinking of targeting something specifically and putting some money into doing the kinds of connections you're talking about? So for instance, I do a fair amount of work with archaeologists and they're great fun to work with and not used to working with children. They're used to working with dead things. So, you know, it is a synergy that is really fun and intellectually stimulating. And if we could think of if what we want is a sustainable democracy, we've got lots of people in our field. That's the biggest area of research we've got. We might fund a specific piece of that. Or if there's something else, the geography stuff that Steve was talking about, we've never been able to get much traction on that one. Maybe if we specifically said, this is what our concentration is going to be for a year or for 2 years or whatever, that might help us in some way. And I think that public scholar voice is absolutely essential, because it's the voice that actually communicates to people who are not in the room. Not in our room anyway.
Michael, jump in.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's great to see some familiar faces from Dublin, and I'm brand new to SSEC. Thanks to Joe Stoltman for getting me involved. And I'm really interested in this conversation over interdisciplinarity. And I'm sorry if some of these questions may seem naive. Like I said, I'm just new to your organization, but it just strikes me as a really fruitful and productive approach to looking at problems in education if we can figure out how to bring in theoretical, methodological approaches from the social and economic sciences more broadly into our subject areas in education. One question I'm wondering about is, has SSEC ever had a joint conference with, say, a social science organization such as the American Association of Geographers, or other organizations that represent sort of the academic research community, who don't do research on education per se, but maybe that's one way of bringing some perspectives together. And it could just be a small scale conference. I'm working on a research proposal right now where I'm putting in a budget to do something of this nature, because, just use a quick example, some of the work that Joe and I and others are doing with the National Assessment of Educational Progress is really beginning to point to the need to bring social scientific perspectives to problems in education, such as unequal opportunity, unequal outcomes, in order to look at factors beyond curriculum instruction that have an impact on school quality and school outcomes, et cetera. And I found, when I approach my colleagues in geography with this information, that they're very receptive, both people who are quantitatively oriented and qualitatively oriented. I have a group of cultural geographers who are developing a research practice partnership for racially equitable curriculum. And that has to be very contextual, localized, but I have always perception, and this may be, I'd be curious to hear from others, of, in my geography discipline, there's a perception that when you talk about geography education, they think, well, that's something that's happening over in the College of Education, and there's nothing I can do to get involved in a way that's going to be productive. But I just don't think, I think that's not the case. And I wonder if there's just a potential here to do something collaborative, like a joint conference or a workshop, whatever, in order to have these communications and conversations, because I really think, because there's a history to education, there's a sociology to education, right? There's economics to education, and if you present that in a way that connects with, how people who do basic research in these areas understand, they're not experts in curriculum instruction, but they have these perspectives and they have these methods that could really, I think, be productive collaborations in a research set. So I'll just stop there, and I'm curious to hear what you all have to say.
given Michael what you said, I think that, I mean, it really describes a possibility of what we could be doing and what, where the future of social science, social studies research can go if we can build those bridges, right? If we can open those doors. And if the other side is willing to, think about and be committed to, being committed to the idea that they do have a role in educating educators, right? I mean, I'm kind of lucky in the sense that one of our geographers is presenting at the National Geographic Geography meeting that's occurring in Minneapolis. But when I suggested that he and then the co-presenter might think about like doing something at the state level for the Wisconsin Council for Social Studies, then the answer was, well, but that's could just be teachers, right? So yeah, so like we can open the door as much as we want, but can we, how do we build those bridges to make sure that other disciplines are more receptive, to that invitation?
It would be interesting to actually go into their organizations. I think that we're inviting them in, but if they're not willing to come in, we have to go to them. So I think it's crossing bridges on multiple sides. I think
part of the key too is finding people like Joe Stoltman, who is a member of the Geography Club, who says, I know a couple of people who would be good and interested. And if we can do that in the variety of social sciences, you got to know that there are some people who know people who are interested in schooling, preparing young people in the field. That's tough, but it's what's been done in the past, and that's how we got Michael. So more of same.
Yeah. And I recall an AERA presidential address a number of years ago. I mean, it was pre-COVID. The president, I'm pretty sure, was in St. Louis, Missouri. And he was really focused on challenges in urban education. But what he used was a geographic lens to get the audience to see urban challenges differently than they had before. And that to me is kind of a good example of, overlapping interests on a specific issue at a particular place when we're talking about geography. I'm sure if we were talking about anthropology, it would be.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, the history organizations all have sections that do history education. They tend to be more secondary. There's not much attention to elementary. And that NCSS comes out of some of those collaborations from early 20th century. So we've got that history there. The issue is the cost of going to somebody else's conference and whether anybody will pay you to do that. So in some ways, it's a little easier for collaborations to occur on your own campus, and you find somebody. So for me, I work with the historians, I work with the archaeologists, that kind of thing, because that's free. Going to the conferences, we have to get grants, we've got to get money, that kind of stuff. So if we're going to support something like this, we would have to think about paying for people to attend, because those conferences are expensive anymore. They always
pre-COVID, SSEC was talking about going to Alabama and looking at civil rights history.
Yeah.
People in other organizations would be interested in that as well. It doesn't have to be just SSEC. I mean, maybe it's some geographers would be interested, or maybe, some political scientists. I don't know. Though I understand that's no longer in the schedule, and I'm disappointed. I thought that was a great idea.
Maybe redefining also what networking looks like, because a lot of my contacts have come from service, and getting involved in different organizations where a lot of it is either community service related, but also motivated by interests that are in my field of research. So a lot of the contacts, you don't have to travel somewhere. You could go in your own backyard and make the necessary contacts that would breed civic engagement. So I think it's just redefining what networking, official networking looks like. You don't have to put on a tie. You don't have to like get dirty, get out in the dirt. Like it just redefine what like an official network looks like for sure, because it's all built relationally.
I think to build off of Kelsey and Linda, what you were both saying is you're right, like going to another conference or asking someone to come to our conference is expensive. And sometimes those budgets are dwindling. But maybe one angle at this would be to really seek out who in our organization or people that we know that are in social studies education are already on their campuses working with someone in the social sciences. And then how could we have a webinar or something of this nature where they're showcasing what they're already doing, and we have both the teacher educator and the social scientist explaining that and having some models. And this was making me think about in this past year, I've been able to work with another colleague, Jesus Serrato, in social science education, and we're working with some colleagues in the history department, creating some events at a local, a former plantation cottage that's part of our campus. And we're working together to have some workshops with educators about how to teach that difficult history at the local site. And we're also, Kelsey, trying to think about what are some community organizations that may be interested in that. And so, for example, we have an organization called Lee County Remembrance Project that's connected with EJI in Montgomery, and thinking about racial lynching history local to this space too, and how they could be involved in those conversations. And so that may be a neat way to really showcase some good things that are going on in different places to really spur some of that collaboration, Michael, that you're bringing up and talking about.
This may or may not be the time, but before we run out of time, I want to make a plea for not abandoning our educators in states that have passed oppressive legislation. And I understand there are arguments for boycotting, but I think our teachers need us more now than ever. And just because they happen to be teaching in a particular county, that has a legislature, I really don't want our social studies organizations, to only work in blue states. And I guess I'm saying that now, being in the heart of these states that have these things.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm really glad Sarah and her colleagues carry on.
Right. And Charlie just posted, that great question. The question I raised earlier is how do we support teachers, right, who are facing this level? And the key thing is we got to frame it in censorship. This is, censorship. Right. And it's not just even about academic freedom. We're silencing teachers at a time, silencing teachers at a time when teachers are working in increasingly diverse schools.
And I also
Charlie, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kelsey.
I was going to say, I appreciate Charlie stating the under stress component. Everything that I research is on and using mindfulness interventions for stress regulation purposes. And I'm at a conference right now talking to actually with the organization now that partner with a nonprofit. It's called the Namaste Project. And we specifically work with educators in trying to sustain them in the education system because they're under such stress from a lot of these policies that are happening. So I think it's a 1-2 approach, because if you are only focusing on stress regulation, you're actually not solving the problem. You're just putting a Band-Aid on it. So it has to also be focused on policy. So I think that SSEC does a wonderful job on supporting the policy element. I think there also needs to be, this is across the board, not just SSEC related. This is an education problem where it also needs to be focusing on the holistic health of educators, especially in oppressive states.
Kelsey, if I can piggyback off of you for a moment too, and recognize the policy work that is needed and the attention to stress that is needed for all educators in these environments, with particular attention to those who identify with historically marginalized communities, because then your own person, your own existence is being threatened, as well as your ability to teach accurate history that reflects part of your own identity, right? And so I think that as we consider that, we need to pay special attention to those who are under threat from their own identity perspective.
Mhm. In Kentucky, the teacher of the year resigned a teaching position because, as part of the announcement about him being the teacher of the year, it was also an announcement that he was gay, and he started getting death threats. And this was a rural community, and he said, I'm not willing to do this anymore, and he left.
I'm
That's
gonna throw it out there.
Example. Thank you, Linda, for bringing that to our attention, because that's a poignant example of exactly what I was saying. Thank you. Go ahead, Kelsey.
Yeah. I think it's also important to look at this as well in higher education too. As a person that identifies as queer and neurodivergent, a lot of the experiences that I had within the academy, especially in the geography, the specific places that I held positions at, were quite oppressive in nature to my own identity, which caused a lot of stress, and had a very challenging time in putting out quality work within social studies environments. So I think it's, again, something to be considered about how we're actually sustaining the field. Yes, we can put information out there that is wonderful, that contributes to like what social studies is as a whole. But if we can't sustain the people that are actually in the environment, then what do we have?
So I will maybe say, as we are wrapping up right now, that you're leaving us with a good charge, Kelsey. We all know that we have work to do, that work is not going away. And I really appreciate people being here on a Wednesday night, being willing to share experiences, wisdom, and insight as we think about how SSEC can be a part of solutions, and really being intentional about that work that we're doing as we move forward, learning from the work that SSEC has done, and really thinking about how we need to work to move forward in the unique context that we're in right now. I want to also piggyback on what Kelsey mentioned about hoping that this continues to be a space that really lifts up mentorship. And I'll say, at my first SSEC conference in Italy, Dr. Hahn gave me specific feedback on my paper. And I thought, I've never had that kind of thoughtful feedback in this type of context. And it's just really encouraging and inspiring, and helps to deepen all of our scholarship. And so I really appreciate that, and hope we can continue to do that work of mentoring and learning from each other. And I do want to kind of put in a plug for the upcoming things that are going on. So next month, the last Wednesday of October, we will have a book launch webinar highlighting some authors in the newest book that will be coming out through the SSEC series of Out of Turmoil, Catalysts for Relearning, Reteaching, and Reimagining History in Social Sciences. At KUFA, we hope to have an SSEC gathering, and so please look out for emails if you're going to be at KUFA, then hopefully you can come hang out, and we can just socialize with one another and continue conversations like this. In early November, we will have a call out for proposals for the 2023 conference. And then, of course, if you're wondering about being an SSEC member, that comes with a reduced conference registration and this free book. So we encourage you to join. And if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to me or anyone in the organization. And again, thank you so much. I know there's some thanks in the chat, and we hope everyone is safe, stays safe and well as you leave here tonight.
I'd like to close with one thing, and that is that it is really exciting to see this kind of conversation happening, to see SSEC reinvigorated. Everything I heard about your trip to Ireland was so positive, and I'm really pleased. I hope this movement continues.
Thank you, all you newest members, for your great enthusiasm and good thoughts. And SSEC is in a great place because of all of you.
Yep.
I want to thank the panelists, all of the panelists, but especially given what we've just said, is especially those who have been members of the organization for a long time. You can see how valued your presence is among the membership of SSEC, and I hope we can continue to call on you and our other colleagues at SSEC who can become part of that longer term mentoring. You can see that it's valued, and it makes the organization both unique and attractive to young scholars. So thank you very much, and thank you all for participating. The recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel for other people to see. And I very much hope to see you again. And those who are not yet members, I will hope to see your membership application as soon as you get off the, well, maybe not that soon. But thank you again very much to everybody. Sarah, you want to say goodbye and we'll be gone.
Yes, thank you all again. We really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.